Thank you for participating in the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series. This workshop covers the topic of building your regulatory strategy. This breakout room, moderated by Dr. Ben Berman, discusses the topic of therapeutic devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics.
Okay, recording in progress, I just heard. That's great. And then I also want to talk about breakthrough device designations, because I think this is especially interesting for NIH small businesses, because here we are, right, on the cutting edge of medical research. And so it makes sense that there are a lot of NIH small businesses that are especially interested in the breakthrough devices program. So I want to talk a little bit more about what that is, what it isn't, and what you can expect if you decide to go down that pathway. So first, 510Ks. So if you are interested in things like what are the costs and timelines associated with a 510K submission, all of that is readily available on FDA's website. So a quick search of 510K timeline or 510K user fees will tell you exactly what those costs are. I did want to mention that as a small business, FDA can authorize reduced fees. And I think this is something like, it's almost an order of magnitude reduction in the fees. So, from something like a 510K costing $12,000, that's submission can instead cost, I think, $3,000. And I think the metric on a small business, it's all on their website, but I think it ties to either the revenue or the number of employees, or potentially both. But you can find out more about CDRH small business certifications on the FDA's website. And that can help sort of gauge expectations around, okay, once we send it to FDA, what kind of timeline can we expect? Of course, there's a lot of work that goes into getting ready for that 510K submission, and I think that's important as we talk about the theme for today of building a regulatory strategy. I think the number one most useful resource, whether it's for a 510K or one of the other pathways that I mentioned, is to do a little bit of research on FDA's public databases on similar technologies. Because whether if you know the product, if you've seen it, or if you've compared against it, directly, or you've heard of it, and your business is competing with these other potential options, though the regulatory decisions that led to those products being on the market today are public. At least a summary of those decisions is public. So you can usually see things like what type of standards did they use in their performance testing. You can see the specific indications for use that FDA cleared to allow them to be on the market. So it can be really helpful when you decide, all right, we need to draft some specific language for the indications for use of our product. Well, how does our product compare to theirs? You can read those other indications and say, all right, ours is the same in these ways, but we have extra indications in these different contexts, and you can add that in. So those decision summaries are really, really helpful to get an overview of those products and gauge expectations. Sometimes they'll even include things like the number of patients that may have participated in a clinical study, ranging from dozens to thousands. That type of information may be included in the decision summary. What sometimes is not included are the specific thresholds of accuracy and precision. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but that discussions that you have then with FDA saying like, okay, we've read this previous decision summary, we've seen the amount of patients involved. We think that this level of accuracy is sufficient for our intended use. Does FDA agree with that, right? So you can really use those decision summaries as a springboard for more specific conversations with FDA. So somebody asked for a decision summary FDA link. So if you type, sorry, it's going to be hard for me to share links as we have our discussion, but if you type in CDRH medical device databases, let's see, great. And then the first hit will take you to a list of several different databases. And so if you're looking for 510K decision summaries, then you can find the database specifically for 510K pre-market notifications. Then you can search that database with keywords or specific brands or specific products and navigate your way to a very, very specific decision summary for a specific product. Same goes for de novo. If you're looking for a product that's on the market and you're looking for its decision summary, you happen to know that it's a de novo granted product. There we go. Thank you, Saroj. That's great. So there's 510K, and you'll find other databases there where you can navigate toward those decision summaries. Somebody asked what happens if your 510K is denied. This is a good question. A couple things can happen depending on when the decision is made. So a 510K application can be denied if it is incomplete, meaning if you send FDA papers, for your 510K application and they say not everything is here. In that case, they can hand it back to you, and in a sense, your application has been denied. They have refused to accept your application. In this case, no harm done. You can go back to the drawing board, finish your application, and resubmit it to FDA. There's no user fees lost. So no problem there. However, if FDA does start reviewing your medical device and eventually determines this is not substantially equivalent, then they will collect your user fees and they will tell you that you are not authorized to go to market, and they will explain why. When your product, this doesn't happen too frequently, but if you get to that point where FDA says, hey, this is not substantially equivalent, and they issue that formal determination, that doesn't mean that your product is, forbidden from market. You can take their feedback. Maybe it's because they needed more testing. Maybe it's because your labeling claims didn't match your indications for use. There's some type of feedback that led to that roadblock that you guys couldn't resolve through the review process. And you can still submit another 510K after that. So I wanted to mention that since it was asked. And how does the de novo pathway compare to 510K? So if you're going to submit a 510K application, you need to select one specific predicate device. And you will be arguing through your 510K application that my product is substantially equivalent to this other product. And there is a guidance document on this process. There are certain things that FDA is looking for when they're talking about this substantial equivalence determination. So you can do sort of a line-by-line comparison of your technology to theirs. You can add additional claims. You can say these are the dozens of ways that our products are the same, but hey, ours also does this. We have this additional functionality. We can serve some additional patients with a different condition, and that can be added. That can be tacked on, and that doesn't mean you're no longer substantially equivalent. It just means that in those situations, you have more of a burden to prove to FDA that you're still substantially equivalent by providing things like bench testing, animal testing, human testing, whatever most supplements that argument with data, with scientific evidence, is what FDA will be looking for to still issue that 510K clearance. So if you cannot find a predicate device, that's when you may be thinking about the de novo pathway. And the de novo pathway is, it's kind of in between. So 510K has again, a very streamlined, I think it's a 100-day timeline that FDA will try to issue their decision. De novo is a little bit longer, but not quite as long as PMAs, pre-market approvals. So if you decide to submit a de novo, the real challenge will be writing down the controls for future devices. So for your device, first of all, but also controls that are broad enough for future devices to also be able to use similar performance testing, similar labeling, similar verification and validation, similar indications for use that you're setting, you're blazing the path through this de novo, but other products will eventually come to market through 510K. And it's just important that when they go through that 510K process and they follow the controls that you helped to develop through your de novo submission, that their products will be safe too. So that's kind of what makes de novos hard, is that you have to sort of establish the safety and efficacy of yours, but also lay the groundwork for future products as well. So de novo is a bit more challenging, but if you can, work out with FDA that de novo does seem like an appropriate pathway, it is generally preferred to a pre-market approval, which is more expensive, requires a higher level of safety and efficacy in clinical testing. So the goal would be to try to find a way to make de novo work. Okay, I feel like I've been rambling on 510K, so I'll stop there, and I'm sure there are more questions. I see things coming up in the chat. Before I open it up, let me just briefly talk about the Breakthrough Device Designation Program. So the Breakthrough Device Program is offered by CDRH as a way of saying, if you can demonstrate to us, to CDRH, that your product is more important, essentially, there's more effective in certain clinical contexts, it has significant benefits over things that are already on the market, or maybe it's just a completely new product that has benefits that really no other product can match. So if you can demonstrate these things to CDRH, then CDRH offers more interactive review when you do eventually get to either that 510K, de novo, or PMA. That's all. So nothing more, nothing less. So they do not specifically alter the timelines of that 510K. So let's suppose you get a breakthrough device designation and then you submit your 510K. FDA does not commit to a shorter timeline of review, but they do commit to picking up the phone when you call, putting the review of that technology to the front of their list, and trying to get that breakthrough product to market as quickly as they can. So understanding, first of all, like what it really means. Of course, if you received a breakthrough device designation from CDRH, there are other benefits outside of FDA, surely, for your small business when it comes to raising investments and generating interest in your product. That's great, and not to be underestimated, but FDA won't necessarily be paying attention to those things, right? For them, it will really come down to the technology. So there are two kind of sticking points when it comes to these breakthrough device designations. So far, all of that sounds great. But the first thing to understand is that requesting a breakthrough designation from CDRH is a non-interactive process. So it's not the same as asking questions of CDRH saying like, hey, this is how we plan to test it. Does this seem adequate? These are the indications for use that we have in mind. We've added these additional claims. Is this still appropriate for this product classification? These types of things, right? Those are great questions, and you should ask CDRH, but you should not ask them through a breakthrough device designation request. Those are good questions for a pre-submission meeting, which I touched on in the joint session, and we can talk more about here. But pre-submission meetings are really recommended for everyone. It's a great way to get feedback on questions like those. But when you submit your breakthrough device designation, it's not a time to be asking questions for FDA. It's really to be laying out your plan. All right, here's our development plan. Here's where we are now. Here's why this product is a breakthrough device. And you will send those to FDA, and FDA will send you their decision. That's it. That's the interaction that you have, sending of the documents and receiving of yes or no. So it's not a good question, not a good time for a question answer. So that was my first point there. The second point, and my last point before I open it up for questions, thanks everyone for your patience. But with the breakthrough device designation, one thing that's important is that in addition to the breakthrough device criteria, which you can find, again, with a quick search, CDRH breakthrough devices, you'll see the criteria there. And those are the things that you need to argue through your application are applicable for your device. But in addition to those, what FDA really needs to have is, according to their guidance document, a quote unquote reasonable expectation that your device can meet those criteria. Not a prototype of your device, not a design idea for your device, but your device specifically. In other words, what you need to have is a certain level of maturity of your device before you go down the breakthrough device designation program. It's not a very useful program if you're trying to generate interest or revenue for a testing of a prototype, for example. What FDA wants to see for a breakthrough device designation is, hey, we see your device, we expect that it meets these breakthrough criteria, and we're ready to review it, right? Send it to us now and we'll review it as quickly as we can. If there's still a lot of questions like, oh, is the design finalized? You know, like what types of components are you going to use? How are you going to go from this part of your software functionality to this? What are the sensors that you're going to have in between? Have you tested them? Have you selected them? If there's a lot of questions or uncertainty about the final form or the maturity of your device, then FDA is likely to say, hey, thank you for the breakthrough request, but we do not have a reasonable expectation that you'll meet the criteria just because the product is not yet mature enough. So something to keep in mind. It's a little bit harder to wean that out from the FDA guidance, but we have seen, especially working with NIH innovators who, again, are always on the cutting edge, are always trying to make breakthrough innovations. That's a lot of times where they get hung up, is that they go through that breakthrough pathway a little bit too soon, and then FDA is not able to authorize it. So if you are early on and you do have questions for FDA and you're starting to think about this and you want to get eventually to breakthrough, start with a pre-submission meeting. That's where you can ask FDA your questions. You can talk about which pathway seems most appropriate. You can select your predicate and say, do they agree? You can say, here's our bench testing plan, et cetera. So with that, I've seen a lot of questions in the chat. I'm sorry I'm not keeping up, but I would love to open it up. So whether it's 510K or breakthrough, and I know there were a lot of questions as well on digital health, which we haven't got to yet. I'd love to hear from you in the room. What are some additional questions that are on your mind when it comes to medical device regulatory strategies? And I'll open up the chat, but if you can beat me to it and come onto microphone, then the floor is yours.
Hey, Ben, I was just wondering, from what you were saying, it sounds like a breakthrough designation. You should almost wait until you're ready to submit your full application.
Yes.
For approval. Is there anything similar for PMA versus the 501K that you talked about?
Yes. Great question. So the breakthrough device designation pathway could be for 510K, PMA, or de novo. So all of those are applicable. And I think it's a good rule of thumb to say that you should start that designation request when you're almost ready to submit your regulatory filing.
Okay, thank you.
In certain situations, you may be able to move that earlier based on the amount of evidence that you have, based on the final, how final and mature your device is. But the good rule of thumb is, just before submitting that application.
I have a question for the timing to submit 510.
Mm-hmm.
Based on your experience, should we consider, it's kind of want to know when we should submit 510K for the SBIR as TTR? It's phase 1, at the end of phase 1, or beginning of phase 2, or end of phase 2?
So that is a great question for your program officer. I'll leave it there because I don't know the intricacies of how the NIH grant requirements intersect with the FDA regulatory requirements. So again, I'll leave it there. Great question for your program officer. Apologies, I don't know the specifics of the different timing, how these different requirements tie into your grant applications.
Question on digital devices.
Mm-hmm.
I'd put this in the chat, but for a software function in a cell phone,
yes,
where does that lie? Is it fully exempt from 510K, or what's the process? What's the path?
That is a great question. So, of course, the answer is it depends. But when it comes to mobile medical apps, first thing I'll say is FDA has a great guidance document on this. So that one is, let me see, mobile medical apps, CDRH guidance, worth a drop into chat here if I can find it. Yes, okay, great, here it is. So I'm gonna drop this into the chat. Mobile apps and software guidance. And here's a link to it. So the appendices of this guidance document that I just dropped into chat are really excellent because they include examples of specific types of products that fall either under FDA regulation. So these could be mobile phone applications that utilize external sensors, for example. A lot of times these are the types of products that are still regulated by FDA. For example, if your smartphone was connected to a thermal camera or something to that effect, where your phone was controlling some sort of external sensor like a camera or a heartbeat monitor, whatever it might be, then those are examples where FDA does still see those as medical devices and does intend to regulate them through 510K. But it also includes two other categories. So the first category is that, right? These are mobile phone apps that are still medical devices. The second is mobile phone apps that do meet the definition of a medical device, but CDRH sees these as very low risk and does not intend to exercise their enforcement. So these types of devices are called under enforcement discretion. And you'll see a long list of examples there in that guidance document. What does it look like to be a mobile phone app under enforcement discretion? And you'll see lots of different examples. I think there are, dozens. And you can say, okay, the technology that I'm developing is more similar to these. It doesn't have to be an exact one of these, but it shares the similar traits with these. And it's very different from those that are listed under, medical devices requiring 510K. So you can really learn a lot from those examples. And the third category is simply not a medical device. Examples include things like communication tools between you and your doctor, or electronic health records, or educational materials that could be put into a mobile phone app. So those are just a few examples, but again, in the appendix, you'll see more where you might actually just not be a medical device, even if you are, doing some, maybe accessing patient data or accessing educational materials, whatever it might be. You might just not be a medical device, but if you are a medical device, then you'll see some examples there where either based on risk, you're under enforcement discretion, or you would still need to submit a 510K. That is still possible.
Thank you.
Great.
And if a medical device is designed for the animal use only, for clinical studies, does it need a FDA regulation?
So the medical device is for animals only. Interesting question. So in that case, you're going to go through the Center for Veterinary Medicine, not to the Center for Devices and Radiological Health.
Center for what?
For veterinary medicine.
Oh, veterinary.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Good question.
Ben, the resource you were just talking about a second ago for Jeff, did that go through in the chat? Because I'm missing it.
Oh, shoot. Oh, thank you so much. I sent it as a direct message accidentally. So I really appreciate you stopping me. Thanks.
Sorry,
Gary.
thank you.
Yep, there it is. So mobile apps and software guidance, and there's the link, and it's the appendices there. I mean, take a quick scroll through, it's all good stuff, but those appendices with multiple examples of the different types of devices, that's I think most helpful there. So I saw John, you also had your hand raised.
Yeah, Ben, I think I got my answer
in
chat, but I would add to this conversation to Jeff. I put a link in for the Digital Medicine Society. Anybody doing any work with mobile apps, wearables, et cetera, digital therapeutics should connect with them. They have a leading group in Boston that can help with some guides.
Great. Thanks, Sean. And Anand, you have your hand raised?
Yes, thank you for this informative meeting. I had a question about the timing of when you recommend one engages with the FDA for a pre-submission inquiry. Should this be early on in R&D? As we're interested, we're a company that's developing an IVD for a hematologic disease? Should this be early on in R&D, once we're deeper into R&D so we know the assay format? When do you recommend this?
Great question. And the rule of thumb is early. Earlier than you think is the right time to reach out to FDA for that pre-submission meeting. But more specifically, I think it ties to the questions that you ask in that meeting. So if you already have a very specific intended use in mind, and you have an initial product and you have a testing plan, and your question is whether these regulatory pathways are adequate, is this predicate suitable, these types of things. These are questions that you can get answered pretty early because they don't necessarily tie to the results that you're getting with your verification and validation, right? This is more almost conceptual, where you're saying, okay, this is the product that we are developing, and this is the path we're headed down, and it's more just a check with FDA saying, okay, these are the indications for use. This is how we describe what our product does, and get FDA's concurrence with your plan based on that description. That's something that you can do pretty early, and it will really help because FDA might say, hey, if you're going to say that it can do this much, then your testing plan is adequate. But because you say it does this extra thing, we're going to expect to see a lot more testing. And that type of feedback you want to get as early as you can. You don't want to think, okay, I've done all my tests, I'm really mature, I'm almost ready to submit, and then you go to FDA with a pre-submission and they say, nope, sorry, you've got all the wrong types of data, we need to see this, and this that you haven't considered yet. So I hope that answers your question. It's without knowing your timeline, I'm sure we could get into a little more specifics, but generally speaking, the earlier the better. And it really just comes down to crafting those first questions for that first round. You don't have to get all your questions answered in that first meeting, but that first meeting can be really helpful to get that, to set you down the right pathway.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. And let's see. Let's go to Joe Beggs.
Hi there. So kind of going off of that question, and this might have been answered, this might be answered in the document you gave, but is determining what type of like the application makes it, like which of the three types, like whether it's a medical device or not a medical device, is it affected at all by the extensiveness of the data, or just by the type of device it relates to, or by how that or by how that information is intending to be used?
I think it is mostly the last thing you said, but also a little bit of the second, and hardly at all the first thing. So the extensiveness of the data might change some of maybe some of the cybersecurity considerations, or it might tie into the complexity of the algorithms that you may be using. But the really fundamental part is how it's going to be used, and what risks may be inherent in the technology as well, right? Is the sensor passive or active? These types of things. So there's the sensing component that you may or may not have on a software product, but then there's still the criticality of the output, right? What is the user going to do with this information? How accurate is the information? These types of things are really important in sort of finalizing that risk level. And to that end, there's one more link I can drop here in the chat. This is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, Software as a Medical Device Risk Assessment Framework. And if you scroll down there, you'll see kind of what I just said in a nutshell, where this is not exactly, so FDA's regulations don't line up one-to-one with this risk-based framework, but this does help you gauge, right, how significant of a risk your software may be dealing with based on the healthcare situation, right? So if this is to be used in like the emergency room, right, that might be, a more critical healthcare situation. And then what are people going to do with the output of this device? What is your nurse? What is your doctor? What is your healthcare provider? What are you going to do once you get the output from this software? And that also ties into the risk level. And you'll see that kind of described in that risk-based framework. So I hope that kind of helps. And then I think then it's connecting the risk as you see it to your intended regulatory path. And, you drive that conversation. So, if you see your risk in a certain way and you paint that picture for FDA and you say, because this is how we evaluate our risk, we see this is the most suitable regulatory pathway for our device. And that's, FDA will respond to the path that sort of you set forward and that you drive for. And you can, they can either course correct through pre-submission, asking these types of questions. Does FDA agree that, based on our level of risk, a de novo application is suitable? And they can kind of give you that type of feedback through the pre-submission process. Or likewise, your pre-submission question might be, we perceive our level of risk to be here, and we think this is under enforcement discretion, meaning we don't have to submit any type of regulatory filing. That's also a perfectly fine pre-submission question, and FDA can let you know, like, yes, this type of a software would be under enforcement discretion. So does that help, Joe? I think it was Joe, sorry.
Yeah, no,
okay.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, let's go to Alan and then Gabrielle, and then we're gonna sort of wrap things up, and then I'll stick around after 4 o'clock for a few other questions. Happy to keep the discussion going a little bit longer. So Alan.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Ben, sorry, I was just going to ask if you can fit Carrie in as well.
Yes, Carrie too. Yep, thank you.
Great, this has been really helpful. Really appreciate it. We're developing a device and we're doing animal studies now. Where do human clinical trials fit into the timeline of FDA approvals?
Good question. And it's tricky to say without like the specifics of your development timeline and your specific technology and where these things fall for different products. It varies widely. A lot of devices don't do any human testing, and a lot do, and everything in between. So when it comes to the human testing, I think the first step is always with your IRB. And maybe this is obvious, but we've certainly spoken with some innovators in the past where it's not necessarily, right. They're really trying to like get all their ducks in a row, like all the way down to FDA and potentially IDE or investigational device exemption, and trying to think about that process. But really the first step is talking with your IRB and saying, hey, this is the human testing we plan to do. Run it by your IRB, and they'll be the first ones to tell you about the risk level associated with that. And your IRB may tell you this is high risk. Here's some things you need to do, but also one of those things is you have to go talk to FDA to get a risk determination done. And you can do that. So there's a process where you describe your test plan and you get a significant risk determination from FDA. And that will enable you to either conduct your research because FDA has said this is not significant risk, or if it does come back that this, they do see this as significant risk, then you need to go down the other path toward an investigational device exemption. And these do take time. So hard to put a timeline on that sort of IRB interaction phase, but if you submit for a risk determination, a human studies risk determination, then that will usually take around 60 days. And then if it comes back, hey, this is a significant risk device, then you need to start thinking about an IDE, an investigational device exemption. And that could be lengthier, especially if you have questions about what that human testing how that will be. So if you want to make sure that FDA says, if you have questions about the safety that you're trying to navigate within your study, then that's important that you ask those to, discuss those with FDA before your IDE. So what I'm getting at is you can and often should submit a pre-IDE meeting where you can, again, have this kind of question and answer session with CDRH and make sure that they're on board with your human testing plan. And so that could take about 75 days, from submission of questions to holding that meeting. And then after that, right, there may be some digesting of the information exchanged, and then you can submit your IDE, your investigational device exemption, that will allow your study to continue. And that process is on a 30-day timeline. So once you get there, FDA is really quick about turning that decision around and enabling that human testing. Great. Gabrielle, and then Carrie.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for this meeting. My question is more about the predicate, how you can use it. Does it have to be a similar device? And if it's not, can you just sort of try to replicate their testing?
Great question. So why don't I answer this with a diagram here? So I'm searching in Google here, 510K flowchart, and even just clicking over to the Google Images, you'll see a lot of these. So let me drop this in the chat and hop over to, let's see, this is the 510K flowchart. You can find this in a guidance document, but I just happened to quickly grab it from a FDA slide deck. And I'm looking at slide 16, it's kind of grainy. So again, I recommend going to the guidance document, which I'm sure they link there as well. But basically, there's a few sort of go, no-goes that FDA will have when they look at your device for the 510K clearance. The first is, does it have a new intended use? So if your technology is used in a different way, fundamentally, then the 510K pathway is not applicable. So they really have to start with the same intended use. That doesn't mean they have to be exactly the same. So for example, a lot of ultrasound imaging systems image different things. Some image B mode, some image, different types of Doppler, some have different power, some have different transducers. All of them are ultrasound imaging systems. And so even though there are differences in the technology and there are differences in the manner in which they're used, they're all intended to do the same thing, and that is provide images of the body using sound waves. So there's, for a lot of products, there is room to deviate, to innovate from the existing classification and add features or add new contexts of use, add additional claims while still maintaining the same fundamental intended use. So, but that is step one. So they do have to have the same fundamental intended use. And then you'll see the process, the flow chart continues from there regarding the technology that you have. So the technology shouldn't be radically different. An example, again, for the ultrasound might be, say, okay, if you're doing a thermal imaging system that's going to be used in the same way ultrasound imaging systems are used, that is a completely different technology and it needs to be evaluated differently. And if that's the case, then again, 510K should not be the pathway that you use. You're going to have to go through something else, find a different predicate, or start a new classification through de novo or PMA. So the technology cannot be extremely different, and the intended use needs to be the same. But if you do that, then you'll see on the flow chart that it opens up from there. So if you do have some technological differences between your device and the predicate, then it's a matter of just proving that those differences, just the differences, are still safe and effective, right? So, showing that the similarities are the same and showing that those differences are still safe and effective. And you can do that through bench testing, animal testing, labeling. You can do it through human testing, of course, and the list goes on in terms of how you validate your technology and then demonstrate that to FDA. Does that make sense?
Yes, and then I guess for pre-market approval, do you also have to have a predicate or not really?
Nope. So if for pre-market approval, you don't have to have a predicate. If you are lucky enough that there are similar pre-market approved devices on the market, then you can learn from them. So I mentioned this before about looking up decision summaries. So it won't be that you do a side-by-side comparison necessarily in your PMA application, but if somebody has already gone through a PMA for a similar technology, you should read that decision summary and really get to know the methods that they used, the standards, the claims, and all the different performance that's outlined in that summary.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Carrie?
Yes, Ben, thank you so much. You've touched on this a little bit, but in terms of the definition of a medical device, I work in the area of lifestyle medicine. So things like resilience, stress management, smoking cessation. And we've been given conflicting information on whether or not apps in those areas would count as a medical device.
Okay.
I'm going to look through all the stuff that you've already given, but is there a way to have a meeting with someone to kind of give the exact example to see if they would say we need to go through FDA approval or not? Or is there another resource we could use?
So there is. I want to say, let me just double check here. Sorry. Multiple computers, multiple keyboards. So there is something called a 513G. So a 513G is called a request for designation. And like breakthrough designation, this is a completely non-interactive process, right? So if you want to just say, all right, input description of what we're doing, and then output is FDA saying, okay, this is a medical device, or this is not a medical device, or we don't know, then this is a suitable, pathway to take. With NIH as well as my time previously at FDA, we generally discourage folks from doing 513G because it's great if you get the answer you're looking for, but when you don't have any, there's no enlightening information about like, okay, why, or what could have gone differently, what led to this, right? So it's a really very formal yes/no decision through that 513G. So if you just need that information, it's okay. But if you have maybe more questions that you'd like to tease out, then a better mechanism is just a pre-submission meeting request to CDRH and just saying, we think we are under enforcement discretion, or we think we are not a medical device for these reasons. Do you agree? And you can kind of work that out interactively.
Wonderful. You said that's a pre-submission meeting request through CDRH?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Another thing I'll mention is that there is an Office of Digital Health at CDRH, and I think their email address is simply digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov. And if your question is, does FDA agree that the technology that I've described in this email, is not a medical device? Sometimes, not always, they can give you a response via email, and that's great. I mean, I would start there, especially if you're really thinking, for lots of reasons, I don't think this is a medical device, but let me just quickly ask FDA. You can send an email to digitalhealth@fda.hhs.gov with a question like that. And obviously you need to give them the proper context, how it's going to be used, a full description of the technology, but then they can say like, yes, agree, this is not a medical device, or we're not sure, why don't you submit a pre-submission meeting? Great. Okay, let me say a couple of things kind of wrapping things up so I don't hold everyone, but then I'm happy to stick around for Roger and John and maybe a few other questions from the chat that I haven't gotten to yet. So what I just need to mention here is, one moment, wrapping things up, a quick reminder about the survey. So I think we have someone from NIH, Monique, maybe dropping some information in the chat with some links for the post-webinar survey. But we just really want to thank everyone again for attending. This is such a rich area to discuss. I know there are so many good questions and we've only had time to get through a few of them. So I hope there'll be mechanisms like this in the future where we can really dive deeper, on maybe on digital health or in vitro diagnostics or animal testing, whatever it might be, to really hit all of these really interesting and great questions that we've gotten through the chat, through the discussion, and in advance. So thank you again. I hope that you'll continue participating with these webinars in the future. And do check out the survey. We're really looking forward to the feedback. If you heard some good things, if this was, or if you didn't hear some good things, whatever your feedback may be, we're happy to take that in and make these webinars even better in the future. So thank you, Melissa, for dropping that into the chat, and Monique as well. So I will pause a moment. People are free to go, of course. We are 10 minutes over time, but if you're interested to stick around, feel free. I think I can stick around until 4:30 or so and answer a few more questions. And happy to start with Roger.
Yeah, are there, do these various agencies count? Do you have one shot at asking your questions?
Good. That's a good question. No, you have multiple shots. It's very common for pre-submission, for companies to go through multiple pre-submission meetings before eventually making their regulatory filing. So you say, hey, I think this is my regulatory pathway, and FDA comes back and they say, no, that is not, for this, and this reasons, right? You can do two things with that. You can either adjust, right? You can say, okay, all right, this is not the pathway for us, we'll find a new pathway. Or you can take that feedback and say, well, maybe if we had a different use case, maybe if we modified our technology slightly, that pathway could reopen to us. Yeah. And absolutely, you can make those adjustments and then go back to FDA with another round of questions. And the same applies, ideally, this is sorted out in pre-submission through these meetings and opportunities to talk with FDA. But the same does apply for your regulatory submissions as well, right? So if you submitted a 510K and FDA said, no, not substantially equivalent, and they made that formal determination, that doesn't mean your product is forever forbidden from entering the market, right? It's the same thing. You can either take their feedback from that 510K and say, all right, we need to do more testing to support our submission, or maybe we shouldn't have done a 510K and we actually need to do it de novo, right? So either are okay, and there's very few hard no's when it comes to CDRH. I think I mentioned earlier the 513G, the device designation. That is actually a pretty formal process, and when you send that 513G to FDA and they say this is a medical device, it is. They will not, that is a final determination. That's one of the reasons that we don't recommend people do it, is because you submit a 513G for a given device, and the FDA says, all right, this is a device, or this isn't a device. And then you take that feedback, all right, awesome, now we know. And then through your product development, it changes slightly. So now, okay, does this 513G still hold? Do we need to submit another one? And it becomes, you took what was once a black and white determination from FDA, and now it's like, okay, well, now we're not sure anymore because we made a few changes. So again, I think pre-submission is the best way to hash out those questions and make these types of changes. And absolutely, you can submit multiple.
And can you post in the chats then some of these contacts that we can use for these pre-submission meeting questions?
Sure.
And thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I will drop the pre-submission meeting guidance in the chat, and it is a guidance, so these are always a little dense, but okay. So once again, my favorite part of these FDA guidance documents, hold on, so let me put it here, pre-submission guidance, and then a link. So just like before, my favorite part of all these guidance documents is always the appendix. So through this guidance document, you'll see all different types of pre-submissions meetings that you can request, but really pay attention especially to Appendix 2, which is example pre-sub questions. That's, I think, a really good place to go to say, is this the type of question that would be good for a pre-sub? And they have good examples and bad. And also Appendix 1. So Appendix 1 is your checklist to make sure that you've got all the information that they're going to need to have a productive meeting with you. Great. Let's go to John and then Evan.
Okay, thanks. I was wondering, what are the risks of not receiving FDA approval? Of not requesting and receiving, let's say. For software, let's say, for example.
Sure. So, so I am not a lawyer, and but there are escalating compliance actions that can be taken for products that for manufacturers that are out of compliance. So you can be out of compliance for not obtaining authorization to be on the market, or you can be out of compliance for not manufacturing, not having good manufacturing practices, not having quality systems in place to ensure that your product is safe. You can be out of compliance for a range of reasons, and things don't. So it increments over time as FDA is aware of your non-compliance. You know, it starts with some informal outreach, typically, where they say, hey, you need to be submitting a market application. You know, a not so gentle nudge that says, you know, you need to stop selling this until you come through and get the appropriate approval in place. And it escalates from there into legal actions and, you know, criminal charges, these types of things. Yeah, I'm not sure if that helps or if that's a little broad,
yeah,
but
yeah, it does help. I was yeah, I guess I was just more or less interested to see what the threshold for
sure. Yeah, and you know, it happens. I think for folks coming to webinars like this, it doesn't really happen because you're thinking about your regulatory strategy and you have a plan in place. But you know, for others, you know, rarely maliciously, but you know, more frequently just due to different you know, a difference in expectation or perspective, or they thought things were one way and they're, you know, that they read these regulatory guidances one way and you know, went down that path while FDA saw it a different way. So it can happen, right? So FDA, when it does, FDA will reach out and they'll tell you, hey, you know, you're out of compliance. You need to get in compliance. Otherwise, bad things can happen.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, and Evan.
Hi.
Hi.
So recently, the FDA has issued guidance that contrast agents may be regulated as devices. We are developing a new ultrasound contrast agent via the 505(b)(2) pathway.
Okay.
How would we seek guidance from the FDA to see if the device pathway would be applicable to our product?
Yeah. I suspect that it is, especially for ultrasound contrast agents, but that may not be a surprise to you since you're developing in this space. I think the precedent for radio tracers to be approved through CDER is still there. But for new contrast agents, especially those that are, you know, alongside a device like an ultrasound system, it's very likely that would come through CDRH. And the same mechanisms that we've discussed, these pre-submission meetings, are a great place to reach out to FDA to say, hey, here's our contrast agent. Here's how it's used. Here's what it's made of. You know, we just want to check with you. You know, are we going to submit a 510K for this? Or are we going to be talking to somebody differently entirely? And that's a perfectly appropriate pre-submission meeting question for CDRH. In this case, I would even encourage you to, let me drop this in the chat as well, the CDRH org chart. And this is a little tricky with multiple embedded expandable lists here. But so what I just dropped in the chat is the CDRH org chart. And if you're interested in radiological products, then the office you're looking for, if you expand the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, and you scroll all the way down to the Office of, there it is, the Division of Radiological Health. Oops. You'll find email addresses there for the different branch chiefs responsible for different technologies. So in your case, you're developing a new contrast agent for ultrasound systems, and you'll find there the branch chief responsible for that specific technology. In this case, it's mammography, ultrasound, and imaging software. And you could, it doesn't hurt to start things off with an email saying, hey, again, just like we were talking about for digital health, this is a good first step here. I think in this case, it could be a good first step as well, saying, hey, this is our contrast agent. These are the contexts in which it's used. Are we talking to the right people? That's kind of the first question you have, right? Are we going to do this through CDRH, or are we going to do this through CDER? And they should be able to answer a question like that, hopefully before it goes into these lengthy meeting requests.
Thank you very much. I believe it would be to our advantage to do it through CDRH if they agree. We have some follow-on products later that were. It was interesting because in the past I had submitted an IND to use the microbubbles for sonothrombolysis to treat acute myocardial infarction. And I was told, no, that's an IDE, not an IND. And I previously developed Affinity, which is the #1 selling ultrasound contrast agent. And that was through CDER as a drug.
Interesting.
But there's been these recent changes. And so
yes,
I thank you very much, Ben. That's helpful to us.
You're welcome. And take a look at what you can find. If there are examples of microbubbles that have been cleared through FDA already, it would be really helpful to look up those decision summaries to check that you're in the right place. If this is the first microbubble contrast agent to market, then that might not help you. But if there are existing microbubble contrast agents, then take a look to see if you can find some existing decision summaries for those.
Well, it's an interesting field, and it's not clear because the first one to be approved was Albunex, which was a device, and those were albumin-coated microbubbles. And then the second one was Optison, which was, again, albumin-coated, but perfluoropropane microbubbles. And that was a device. And then the subsequent ones, there are 2 other besides Optison approved in the United States. They were as drugs under CDER. But there's been this recent guidance that came out, and I've read it, and it seems that the ultrasound contrast agents fall under CDRH in the future.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, I think, let's see. I see Roger and John with hands raised. Forgive me. Did we get these questions already, or?
I think we did.
Okay, I thought.
Yeah, so. We got mine.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, mine too. Sorry, I just.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. No problem. Just double checking if there was a follow up there. So anyone else sticking around with any other questions? Anyone? Again, apologies. I haven't been very good about questions in the chat, but we've had I think we've had a pretty rich discussion outside of the chat. So anyway, anyone else still here with questions? I'm happy to stick around and answer some follow-ups. Or I see Ori. Ori, can you hear us? Did you have a question? We cannot hear you, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah, there you are. Hello?
Oh, okay. We're developing a medical imaging modality, and we're actually using a therapeutic approach but for diagnostic purposes. So kind of light therapy, but we're using with sensors to diagnose different conditions. So the risk is really from the therapeutic side, and that's already regulated. So that's kind of a 510K, but we're changing designation. So the question is it a 510K or de novo?
Yeah. So to me, it sounds like a new intended use. Same technology, which is good, right? Because you get to leverage all the safety standards and all the existing information that's out there in terms of ensuring the safety of the product. But the fact that it's a new intended use, now it's being used for diagnostics. So there's new questions about, okay, how accurate is it? What other considerations need to be made now as a diagnostic rather than a therapeutic? My understanding is that would be a new product, therefore not a 510K. Therefore, the 510K path would not be appropriate for it. There are wrinkles there, and without knowing the technology space too well, I think if you can find similar diagnostics, maybe diagnostics that make a similar decision using a different technology, and then you can kind of like turn the question to the other way that says like, okay, here are some of the diagnostics that make a similar decision. We're using this technology to do that instead of whatever technology that those other diagnostics are using. So you may be able to come at it from that angle, but it kind of comes down to the specific regulatory landscape that you're dealing with here. So if it is a new intended use, then yes, you'd be preparing to do a de novo application or a pre-market approval. But if you feel like the risk is low based on the therapeutic, based on the testing, based on the different context of use that you're doing, then I think you'd really want to focus on de novo as like the least burdensome regulatory pathway, as long as those risks are controllable.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. All right.
Ben, quick question. If there's any follow-on questions we might have here, is there a way we can reach out to you?
Yes. So let me see if it's been dropped here in the chat. So discuss. Short answer is yes. Let me try to just find it here from our slide deck. I work with the NIH Seed Office in the Small Business Education and Entrepreneurial Development team. And so, yes, if you want to get in touch with our team of regulatory, so I work on the regulatory side, but we also have specialists doing, other aspects of business development, IP. Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. There it is. So you can visit, there it is. Thank you. Questions, email seedinfo@nih.gov, and we're happy to kind of find the right mechanism for continuing on this conversation.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Zainab?
Yes, hi. This has been incredibly useful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And so my question was about this Q-stop meetings. So do you recommend having pre-stop meeting before sending a study risk determination request? So what is the timeline?
Good question. I do recommend that, in part because okay, my understanding is that the study risk determination might be helpful for your IRB, for example, so that they know, that the risks or safety involved with the human testing that you have planned. But that will be limited in utility for you as the product developer, right? That risk determination is kind of just a yes, no, here's where we fall. But through the pre-submission meeting, you get to ask questions and explain to FDA, this is our plan, this is our rationale for why we're designing this study the way we did. Does the FDA agree? And they might be able to say, hey, if you did that slightly differently, then that would lower the risk, or hey, you haven't answered this question, or you haven't accounted for these variables in your study design. They can do that through a pre-submission meeting, but they can't do it through a risk determination request. So if you have questions like that, then I definitely recommend submitting the pre-submission meeting first. if you don't have any questions like that and your studies all is pretty mature and ready to go, then you might just go straight to the risk determination.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, and it's 4:30. So once again, I really appreciate all these questions. I love talking with NIH innovators, and I guess some among us are regulatory nerds like me. So it's fun to try to explore these options and find the right path that makes the most sense for the products that you all are developing. So I really enjoy these types of sessions. I'm only sad that we're so short on time. So thank you again, everyone. Please make sure to fill out the survey. And if you have additional questions, we're there at seedinfo@nih.gov. And I look forward to talking more with each of you in the future.